love making characters. Coming up with their designs, their personalities, their stories, and imagining hypothetical situations to stick them in is like candy to me, and I love an excuse to do it for a video. In the past, I've done a few randomized character challenges where I rolled dice to determine character attributes and did my best to turn those random traits into fully fleshed out characters. I've done 2 videos of that style in the past and have been itching to do a third, but with a slightly different spin. In my previous videos, I used D&D character creation mechanics, and the idea was that each character was a viable and plausible D&D character. However, in the time since my last video, I've started working on my novel The Azure Mirage, a fantasy story that takes place in a high fantasy setting I'm calling Shattered Chord, and I thought it'd be really fun to use that world building for my randomized characters instead. You don't have to be familiar with that story to enjoy the video, I'll be explaining everything as we go, but if you're curious and want more, I'll leave links to some of the other relevant videos in the description. So let's start by explaining how we're going to generate these characters. I wrote a few different randomized trait tables, and we'll be rolling dice to determine what options we go with. We've got Ancestry, which is what kind of being you are. This one I filled out with the main races from Azure Mirage, more on that later. Next is Class and Background, which I kept the same from previous videos. We're still using D&D as a base for these, but rather than being very strict with what they mean, I'm going to be using them more like a jumping off point. We're mostly using them to inform the vibes. And lastly, a table for gender, which is pretty self-explanatory. Now, in previous videos, I had a 5th table I used to determine a character's color scheme. However, this time we're doing something a little more fun. I'm a bit of a dice goblin, and over the years I've bought a lot of pretty tabletop dice sets that I've never actually used. So in the spirit of getting some use out of them, I'll be using the color schemes of the dice I use to roll each character's stats to determine their color scheme. Once I had decided how I was going to generate my characters for this challenge and started rolling though, I pretty immediately started hitting snags. I'd pick a dice set and roll a character, but a lot of the time the results would be too similar to a character I'd already made. So to avoid this, I ended up with a compromise. I rolled a bunch of different characters, all with different dice sets, and picked the 3 that I found the most compelling. I ended up rolling 7 characters for this round. 3 of them I threw out immediately because they were too close to other characters from previous videos, and of the 4 remaining, I picked the 3 that stuck out to me the most. And by that I mean, I saw these lists of random character attributes and felt like I had been struck by lightning. So let's talk about them. Character 1 was actually the first character on that list that I rolled, and I knew what I wanted to do with her the instant I saw the result. So first up, here's the dice set I used. It's a pretty blend of pastel blues and purples with metallic silver paint for the numbers. And using these dice, I rolled a female Fauniel barbarian with the noble background. Fauniels and Shattered Chord are basically animal hybrids, like Sen of the Snow Leopard Girl from my world building video. I had a separate table to roll what type of animal I was going to use and got fish. So we've got a fish girl barbarian with a pastel blue and purple color scheme, and within seconds I was blasted with ideas. So barbarians in D&D are exactly what they sound like. Big buff fighters who can take a hit and dish out big damage. Pretty immediately, that made me think of a beta fish, sometimes called the Siamese fighting fish on account of they are aggressive as hell. You can't put 2 male beta fish in the same tank or they will kill each other. Females are more chill but can still be violent if they're in too small of a tank. Despite that, they're very pretty, and the males have these really long, flowy fins. They also come in a huge variety of colors, including pastels, so I was pretty set on this from the get-go. Additionally, the noble background we've used in a challenge before, but unlike Nyx, my emo tiefling monk from the first character creation video, I think this girlie is a proper noble and really leans into the fancy flouncy stylings of it all. I want to make a bratty princess character who can cleave your ass in twain. I want this so badly! So with all these elements in mind, I started sketching, trying to come up with a storyline as I did. With male betas usually being the more violent ones and her noble background, I had the idea of this character being the youngest and only female sibling in a very big, very rich family, where succession isn't decided by birth order, but by who the strongest fighter is. It's a custom in this family that once all the children of a generation come of age, they all duke it out tournament style, and the winner takes the crown and gets to be the new head of the family. I imagine our fish girl is a pretty strong fighter in her own right, being raised learning how to brawl, but she's also the youngest and only girl, and as a result, her brothers have never really seen her as a threat. I imagine they teased and babied her a lot, despite her being pretty strong in her own right. The tournament to decide the new head of the family will be happening once she comes of age, and at some point she decides, I want to prove them all wrong and win. Not because I want to lead the family, but just to prove that I can. I don't even think she wants to be the head of the family. Politics bore her and she'd much rather live a carefree, comfortable life, spending all her money on tasty food and fancy clothes, but she doesn't want to always be treated like the lowest rung on the family's ladder. She wants respect, and she is very willing to draw blood to get it. And so, a few months before she comes of age, she sneaks off into the night with her two best friends, who we'll circle back to, and vows not to return until she's strong enough to beat all her older brothers into the dust, thus setting out the plotline for this hypothetical story. I had a pretty clear idea of her personality from the get-go, but I still needed to design her properly, so let's get into that next. Because of the silver in her dice color scheme, I wanted to give her at least a little bit of silver armor, despite barbarians in D&D usually being armorless. Again, we're not trying to make proper D&D characters here, we're just using the concepts as jumping off points. I also knew right away that I wanted her to have a big poofy dress. We are going full princess here. Since female beta fish have shorter fins than their male counterparts, I gave her short hair, and I imagine her brothers would all have very long, luscious locks a la Conan the Barbarian. Plus, I gave her fins for ears, because fish. In the process of doing visual research, one of my mods reminded me that beta fish make bubble nests to hide their eggs in, which made me want to incorporate a lot of bubbles and pearls and round shapes into the design. Her father and brothers see her as needing to be protected, and I feel like the bubbles are a fun way to represent that. And maybe as her story goes on, she gradually phases the bubbles out of her outfit to show she doesn't need to be protected anymore, that she's more than capable of taking care of herself. I saw these skirt petticoats made of little puffballs while doing some digging on Pinterest, and decided to combine the concept into a bubble petticoat. However, if I wanted the petticoat to show, I knew the skirt would need to be shorter, and I leaned towards one of those really full but short skirts I've made for idol cosplays. The rounded shape of the ruffles worked really well for it, and the skirt looked nice and bubbly. Looking at both clothing that matched a more traditional barbarian aesthetic, as well as what if you rolled up to the front lines of a fantasy war in a big poofy dress, and seeing Hortensia from Fire Emblem Engage was just, yup, that's her. Stick her underwater and that's the vibe. Wanting to lean more into fish princess emphasis on fish in the design, I added a few underwater elements to the outfit. I included a lot of scalloped trims, flowy sleeves, and transparent ruffles as a callback to fish fins, added a bunch of pearls to look like more bubbles, and gave her both pauldrons that look like nautilus shells and scallop shell knee pads. I also gave her a little crown to really push the princess vibes, and also because it felt like she needed some kind of hair accessory. In addition to her outfit, I also figured I needed some kind of iconic weapon for our fighting fish girl. While I was researching about betas, I found out about a variant called the Half Moon Beta, which is a type of beta with tail fins that form a perfect half moon shape when they're fully flared out. Combine that with her being a barbarian, and that made me think of our girly wielding a giant axe that's modeled to look like a fishtail. Weapon design isn't really my forte, but I'm pretty proud of the axe I designed for our fish girl, and I imagine she'd take a lot of pride in having a giant weapon that's also extremely pretty. It's her favorite accessory. She takes it everywhere with her, never leaves the house without it. Digging deeper into her personality, I liked the idea of her being a bit of a spoiled princess type, but I also love giving my characters depth, so let's dig a little deeper. I think a lot of people in her position would just accept their lot in life and not bother training for the succession tournament at all, and while I think this is what her brothers assume she'll do, our fish girl here is not that type of character. She loves shiny things, she's very girly, she loves sweets and pretty dresses and going to galas, but that does not make her fragile. But that's exactly how her brothers have always treated her. She's been talked down to and condescended her whole life, and that is exactly the type of treatment that builds resentment and the primal need to kick all her brothers' asses out of spite. I imagine all her brothers have various fighting mentors they've trained under, and when she dashes off into the night to get stronger before the tournament, they're the ones she hits up first, wanting to learn their techniques and what potential weaknesses her brothers would have. And while training would be difficult and she'd probably be pretty prissy and complain about being injured or breaking nails, she's also crazy stubborn and 100% the type to get back up over and over and over again despite being bruised and bleeding. I'm gonna do the difficult thing, but I'm gonna complain the whole time type energy. Last but not least, let's figure out her name. Of all the three, hers was the hardest name to figure out. I did a lot of digging into names that were relevant to water, pearls, fish, bubbles, etc., but nothing was really grabbing me. Where my trusty baby naming websites failed me, I started Googling names meaning blank and stumbled onto a random Reddit thread about RPG character names. Someone in the thread mentioned the name Vivian, and something about it just stuck out to me. While it wasn't necessarily water-related, it had that sort of rich girl name aesthetic I was looking for, and she could shorten it to be more casual with friends. So, her name's Vivi. However, I feel like she would absolutely name her giant fish axe, and I have no ideas there, so leave suggestions for her weapon name in the comments. Anyway, with our fish girl done, let's move on to character number 2. So, looking at our potential list of rolled characters, 2 of the 3 I was set on pretty immediately. The first was our fish girl, and the second was this character. Using these gray, gold, and purple liquid core dice, I rolled a human fighter with the folk hero background and a gender of my choosing. And I know what you're thinking! Wow, Star, a human fighter? Way to pick the most boring possible option. Shh, 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 shh. I have an idea. Let me cook. Play with me in this space. This space is my kitchen, and we're cooking. Consider fish lesbians. So let's get into it. Humans are relatively unchanged in Shattered Core's lore, though I am considering changing the names. Kind of like how Dungeon Meshi called all sentient races humans, but the actual human equivalent were called tall men. Jury's still out on that one, I'm not too pressed about it. And fighters in D&D are, well, basically exactly what it says on the tin. They're real good at fighting. And lastly, the folk hero background. Yeah, there's not a lot of spice going on here, is there? But sometimes that's not a bad thing. With simplicity comes a playground for ideas, and when I went in playing with mine, here's what I came up with. So we have our fish girl Vivi as the main character, and her story of setting off into the world to train and become a stronger fighter before the tournament that'll decide the new leader of her family. But fish tend to school together, and I don't think she'd want to go it alone. So I'm imagining her taking some friends along with her, and this is where character 2 comes in. Character 2, who I'll be calling Knight for the time being, is a member of Fish's family guard. Okay, well, not a full-fledged member yet. She's technically still in training, but she's already showing a lot of promise as a fighter. Her mother is the captain of the family guard, and in the spirit of tweaking things slightly for a more interesting story, I think her mother is the actual folk hero, and Knight gets some notoriety for being her daughter, even though she doesn't have any of her own accomplishments yet. I also think that maybe she's a little sheltered. Vivi's family is, well, a lot. A literal entire family of strong-as-hell fighters who would kill just about anyone who even tried to mess with them. So you can imagine they probably don't have to deal with petty thieves and the like very much. So by that logic, running security for them is a pretty easy gig. The perfect environment for a protective mother to train her daughter in without her ever being in any real danger. They don't have to worry much about actual attacks, so Knight gets to stay pretty safe while still feeling like she's making a difference. It's maybe a little screwed up on her mom's end, but hey, perfect fodder for some character development, eh? I think Knight was brought on as her mother's assistant originally, but pretty early on got stolen away by Vivi. Most of the people around her family man are stuffy old guys and prissy old rich ladies and her big beefy meathead brothers, so when there's suddenly another girl around who's pretty close to her age, Vivi basically pulls a catbug. You're my friend now, we're having soft tacos later. And Knight doesn't complain because, well, she falls immediately. First day on the job and she meets this girl who is simultaneously beautiful and an impressive fighter with a bubbly personality but is still stubborn and headstrong to a fault. Oh, the crush is massive and immediate. She yearns for Vivi's affection, pines for her, and yet falling in love with your boss? That's not very professional. That's not allowed. And gods forbid she would never do anything to hurt her crush's reputation or her mother's. And so she keeps quiet, doesn't act on her feelings, keeps a straight face to the best of her ability. But despite her doing her best to hide it, pretty much everyone can tell. Except Vivi, who drags Knight around like a little dog in a purse, her cool and collected bestie who never leaves her side. Imagine the potential for romantic comedy hijinks. I am cooking, people! I think that over time, as the story progresses, Knight would really come into her own. Learn to be more independent, buck the rules a bit when needed, and not give in to the constant pressures of her position and the expectations her environment puts on her. And, you know, maybe that would involve a dramatic confession to Vivi. Who knows? I'm imagining it in my head, it's dramatic as hell. Anyway, with her personality decided, let's get into her design. I imagine Knight being a pretty organized and meticulous fighter, very practical, a rather no-frills personality and appearance to contrast with Vivi being basically all frills. Considering she's a knight, I definitely wanted to give her some kind of suit of armor, though I figured that her being more of a knight in training lent itself more towards something simpler. I ended up giving her a more full set of armor compared to Vivi, though she hasn't quite graduated to full plate yet. Her armor's mostly padded with a few metal bits here and there, but I did give her a little bit of scale mail as a reference to her working for a family of fish people. Again, I looked at a lot of Fire Emblem character designs to try and get ideas for the type of outfit I wanted to give her, and went through several armor variations trying to decide between something more angular versus something more rounded and bubbly to match Vivi. In the end, I decided on the former to give a more interesting contrast between the two of them. I wanted her to look very neat, very tidy, and gave her a short straight bob with straight across bangs and a headband. I also gave her a pretty basic sword as a weapon. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's practical, and it's perfect for her needs. Now, where I struggled with this design was the colors, because based on the dice, her color scheme was going to be this sort of silvery gray with some purple accents, which felt perfect to match Vivi without taking the attention off her. However, I hadn't been looking at the dice too much when I was sketching, and only remembered when it was time to color that the dice have just as much gold as silver in them. Getting gold and silver to play nicely is a nightmare, and I struggled for a while trying to figure out a perfect combination. I ended up using the warm purple of the numbering sparingly just for her headband and sword hilt, and making her clothes cooler gray with dull gold armor. I also made the scale mail sort of an in-between color to help blend the two, and while this color scheme was way out of my comfort zone, I think it came together really nicely. Lastly, for her name, this is one that just kind of came to me when I was designing her. I wanted something simple and proper without sounding overly fancy, so her name's Olivia. Everyone say hi. And with our night girly all finished, let's move on to our third and final character. So, before we get into this last one, I gotta take y'all on a little segue. Walk with me for a minute, we gotta talk about gods. In the Shattered Chord universe, there were 10 gods, all siblings that created the world, with each being responsible for creating some aspect of the planet. We've got the god who created light, the god of stone, the twin gods of plant and animals, etc. After the first 8, the 9th god was jealous of his siblings' creations and tried to destroy the world, becoming known as the god of chaos. The others got mad, they fought, and all 9 gods' bodies were shattered and fell to the planet they just created. The final and youngest god, known now as the god of cycles, used his power to give new life to the shattered pieces of his siblings. The pieces of the god of light became the first elves, the remains of the god of stone became the first dwarves, etc. The main religion of this universe comes from this pantheon, and specifically worship of the god of cycles. His fate after the creation of people from his siblings' bodies, called Shardborn in universe, is unknown. Some believe he sacrificed himself to do it, and some believe he's still out there in some capacity watching over his creations. Whatever the truth is, priests and religious types still largely worship the god of cycles, and with that info out there, now we can talk about our third character. For character 3, I used these glittery yellow dice with gold numbering and rolled a female Sindarin sorcerer with the Acolyte background. Sindarins are basically remixed tieflings. I'm not going to go into all the changes here, but basically they're based on elements rather than devils and demons. If you want more detail, check out my world building video, I talk about it there. Next, sorcerers in D&D are magic casters who get their ability to use magic from their ancestry, usually related to having some kind of powerful being present in their bloodline. However, this gets a little tricky when adapting into the Shattered Chord lore since the magic system is different. There's actually 2 different magic systems, one called Learned Magic, which anyone can use as long as they're willing to study it, and one called Gifted Magic, which is basically superpowers unique to each person. Think the quirks from My Hero Academia. Everyone has some kind of gifted magic, and abilities can range from pretty mundane things like telekinesis or increased strength, to performing magic that goes beyond the limits of what's possible with learned magic. The point is that adapting a D&D sorcerer to this universe means to me that they're not necessarily a versatile spellcaster, but that they have a lot of emphasis on whatever their gifted magic ends up being. Lastly, the Acolyte background in D&D says that the character comes from some sort of background in holy service, worshipping some sort of god and performing sacred rites. Some are priests, some are assistants at temples, there's a lot of options, but basically they have some sort of connection to the gods. Are you seeing why I had to give the lore dump earlier? So with all that in mind, I headed over to the drawing board. Of the 3, this character took the longest for me to figure out a story for, but their looks popped into my head pretty immediately. I couldn't tell you why, but I was immediately drawn to the idea of a character with... I don't know what to call it, but you know that visual design trope in anime where characters sometimes just have their eyes closed all the time? Think Brock from Pokemon and a handful of others. I had this very strong mental image of a character who has their eyes closed and a relaxed, almost cheeky smile on 24/7. Very sweet and cheerful looking, but also maybe a little bit sneaky, like they're always kind of planning something. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with that just yet, but put a pin in it and we'll come back to it later. Also, before we get any deeper, I should go ahead and address something. While the dice dictated that this character was going to be a girl, as I was designing them, I just kept thinking, man, this character is giving major non-binary vibes. And then I remembered that I have free will. So in the spirit of that... There, that's better. Because of the yellow color scheme, I originally thought of a worshiper to the first god, Alfira, the goddess of the sun and light and the mother of elves. But this didn't really stick out to me for whatever reason. Maybe if I had rolled an elvish character, this is where I would have landed, but I ended up exploring some other ideas instead. More than anything, the idea of some sort of scholar stuck out in my head. Someone who researches the ancestral gods rather than just worshipping them. Maybe someone who believes that while the gods are long dead, their traces still linger in every strand of the universe they wove together, and that understanding the ways of the gods is the best way to learn about themselves and the worlds the gods created. But for whatever reason, I also really liked the idea of this character being some kind of card reader? Fortune teller? Listen, I may have just finished watching the first season of The Mighty Nine when I started working on these, and it reminded me of how much I love my boy Mollymauk. Leave me alone. But I did like the idea and kept playing with it, and it tied in surprisingly well with them studying the gods. Following the train of thought that despite the gods being functionally dead, they still have some sway over the world, things like tarot cards could be seen as one way to receive messages from the long-dead divine. And I love the idea of this character whipping out a deck of tarot cards whenever they or anyone around them has a decision to make. Let's see if their holinesses have any input, shall we? Type of vibe. However, I didn't want to just use tarot cards and started playing with a couple different ideas. First up, I decided that the cards they used are based on the pantheon of gods and their notable creations, which makes more sense for this universe. Next, like I said before, most people who worship the gods focus on the god of cycles, and as a result, circles have become somewhat of an identifiable holy shape, like what the cross is for Christianity. So what if their fortune-telling cards were round instead of rectangular? And similar to how tarot cards will have both upright and reversed readings, these cards would have different readings based on the angle they're facing when placed down. Upright, left, right, down, and maybe secondary directions as well. That feeling when designing a character for a video makes you suddenly want to come up with an entire tarot deck equivalent. This is what I mean when I say I like to use characters to world build. I never would have come up with that otherwise, and now I can incorporate that into any of the stories I write. I'm having fun. Anyway, with that basically decided, I started thinking about what their gifted magic would be. Them being a modified sorcerer meant that their gifted magic needed to play a big role in their story, and I started thinking, well, maybe them telling fortunes is related to their gifted magic. What if they occasionally get glimpses of possible futures and believe that the gods are responsible for what they see? Or what if they always see just a little bit into the future, meaning their visions are a little off step from what's actually happening? While it can be super disorienting seeing both 5 seconds ahead and the present time, maybe they don't need their eyes to be open for it to work. The visions come through their mind's eye, not their actual eyes. Maybe they keep their eyes closed all the time to counteract the dizziness and vertigo they get from their future vision not being perfectly aligned with what they're actually seeing. And they've learned over the years to slightly delay their movements and speaking enough to sync up with their visions. They don't have to open their eyes because they see constant visions of everything happening around them, just a touch ahead of everyone else. While it may be difficult for them to explain, I think that's an extremely interesting ability for them to have to work around. Something that can be both a blessing and a curse. How do you live your life always knowing what's about to happen and knowing that you can potentially change things, but not knowing what the result would be if you do? Would you opt to avert disaster if you knew it was coming? Or let things be as the gods have decided they will be, even if that means a potentially negative outcome? Would changing fate be an insult to the ones you believe gave you that ability in the first place? And how would they react if their interference ended up leading to a worse outcome than the one they were originally trying to avert? There's a lot to play with there, and I'm already reeling over how many different ways it could be taken. This is fascinating. fascinating to me. Also, around this point, the name sorrel jumped into my head. Wood sorrel is a type of plant. They're these little clovers with yellow flowers. Their color scheme is yellow, and it just kind of stuck. So I'm just gonna call them that from now on. Now, around this time, I was also trying to figure out how to get Sorrel to fit in with the previously established two characters. They're a researcher of the gods and a fortune teller with future sight abilities. I liked the idea of them being in some kind of service to Vivi's family, as I was already planning on her running off with both Olivia and whoever this character ended up being for her storyline. I started thinking that maybe they were some kind of butler, but that didn't feel quite right. Or maybe they could be a for-hire fortune teller, but that seemed a little bit weird. Then again, maybe that's what makes it perfect. Consider, Vivi and her family are out on the town one day and happen to cross paths with our fortune teller here. As they walk past each other, Sorrel receives a vision that Vivi's life is at stake unless they act right away, and manage to pull her out of the way of danger just before she's, I don't know, crushed by a falling piano or something. The family is stunned that this random person had such quick reflexes, and are super grateful that they helped Vivi out of harm's way. Sorrel would then just say something like, "Don't thank me, thank the gods. They gave me a vision that she would be harmed, and I only acted to prevent a tragedy as anyone would have." The family then reasons that this sounds like a person worth keeping around, and hires them to be an attendant for Vivi. They basically stay by her side to make sure that no harm befalls her. Vivi maybe doesn't care for this at first, since she insists she's not fragile and doesn't need to be protected this intensely, but the two of them really quickly bond over a shared love of gossip and Vivi's fascination with their fortune-telling. While it's a little unorthodox, Sorrel takes to their job quickly. It pays really well and offers free room and board, leaving them with lots of idle time to study. Their visions are centered only on things they'd be present for, so they have to stay around Vivi as much as possible, but I imagine they'd have lots of time to read and occasionally get time off for further research. And while they don't get as much time for their academic pursuits as they'd like, their new job is a hell of a lot more comfortable than their previous living arrangements, so it's hard to complain. And when Vivi decides she's taking off for a months-long training montage, well, of course Sorrel goes with her. They're besties by this point, and it's their job to look after her, and if that means being dragged away on an adventure, then so be it. As a last little detail, I think Sorrel, despite keeping their eyes closed all the time, is extremely perceptive. Always picking up on little clues and tidbits about people, filing them away for future reference. They're extremely good at reading people, and that combined with their future sight makes it very easy for them to control the flow of conversations. A lot of people find this infuriating, and think that Sorrel is at least suspicious, at worst planning the family's downfall. But Sorrel insists, why would they want that? Vivi's family takes care of them very well. They have no reason to wish ill upon them. The pay the family provides for Sorrel's service is what funds their research. Still, though, a lot of rumors fly around this rather fishy, pun unintended, person, and Sorrel simply makes a note of it and continues about their business. But if given the opportunity, they would absolutely read someone for filth with a breezy smile on their face the entire time. Love that for them. While this character took the longest to figure out, I think they ended up being my favorite of the trio for a lot of different reasons, most of which have to do with their interactions with other characters. So, as is tradition, let's finish up by talking group dynamics. Let's start with Vivi and Olivia. I already discussed them a little bit. Vivi is this vivacious and bubbly personality who latches onto Olivia due to them both being girls around the same age. Vivi grew up around a bunch of older brothers and longs to be friends with other girls, but most girls around her age don't really have an interest in fighting like she does. So when she meets Olivia, the daughter of her family's guard captain who's training to be a knight, Vivi sees the opportunity to make a new friend and sparring partner and yoinks her immediately. And like I said before, Olivia is very serious, very meticulous and organized, and not terribly spontaneous. So getting yoinked by Vivi is a little alarming at first, but she falls very quickly. She's never met anyone like Vivi and finds her so irresistibly charming, but is terrified to act on her feelings. A knight must be professional and dignified, and having a blubbering crush on their liege does not fall in line with those ideals. She does her best to stay calm and collected, but her cheeks going bright red every time Vivi smiles at her does not help, and by this point everyone knows about her crush, except Vivi, who's just super excited to have a friend her own age with similar interests. Again, rom-com hijinks galore here. Plus, I think Olivia would be very dedicated to helping Vivi during her training arc, sparring with her so she can practice new techniques, tending to her wounds after a rough practice session, and helping encourage her when she's feeling down. I'm not sure how good she'd be at that last one, but she tries her best and really wants to see Vivi shine, whether she gets to be part of that or not. Next, let's do Vivi and Sorrel. Like I said before, I think their relationship started off a bit tense. Vivi's of course grateful that Sorrel saved her life, but thinks that her family hiring this person off the street to hover around her 24/7 is a bit overkill. Plus, Sorrel keeps talking about the will of the gods and how they can see visions of the future. It all sounds a bit weird for Vivi's tastes. Yet, despite this, Vivi is fascinated by their fortune telling, especially the deck of cards they use, and constantly asks to have the meaning of the cards explained to her and for Sorrel to do readings. I think Sorrel tries to teach Vivi how to use the cards to interpret messages from the gods, but Vivi struggles a bit with the metaphorical aspects of doing readings and mostly just admires the pretty pictures. Plus, Sorrel being so perceptive means that they're a veritable feast of gossip, and the two of them are always sharing tidbits about the goings-on of the family and any visitors. I also think that at some point, Sorrel tries to give Vivi the advice on how she could win the family succession tournament without going through all the trouble of an entire training montage. They'd suggest using her smaller, less intimidating nature to her advantage, lure her brothers into a false sense of security, and then whack them when they least expect it. However, Vivi is stubborn and adamant that if people aren't scared of me the second I walk into a room, then I'm not strong enough yet. Sorrel does think that this is maybe a bit foolish. They believe in using one's natural abilities to the fullest, but respects her decision and helps support her the best they can. Now, moving on to Sorrel and Olivia, this is a fun one. I think that Sorrel has probably been around Vivi for at least a year before Olivia joins the family guard, and Olivia is one of those people who is immediately suspicious of Sorrel. Why do they smile so much? Why do they talk so strangely, yammering on about the will of the gods even though the gods have been dead for centuries? This person is weird, and to Olivia, strangeness means danger. She's definitely wary of Sorrel for a long time, and hell, maybe she doesn't even fully trust them when Vivi drags them both along on her training arc. They seem to have Vivi's best interests at heart at least, but Olivia spends most of the story feeling like they can't fully trust this person, without really knowing why. Meanwhile, I imagine that while Vivi and Olivia are around the same age, Sorrel's a bit older than the both of them. The girls would be around their late teens or early 20s, while Sorrel is around their early 30s. As a result, they take on this sort of mentor role to the both of them, which includes offering advice and different perspectives on their various situations, and also trying desperately to get the two of them to confess. Sorrel is the biggest Oli Vivi shipper around, knows full well how bad Olivia's crush is and how clueless Vivi is, thinks the two of them would be so happy together, and does their best to try and push them together. Like a teacher arranging the seating chart so students with a crush on each other sit side by side in class. Not directly interfering, but some gentle nudges in the right direction to expedite the process. As an example, I'm imagining a day where Vivi, as always, begs Sorrel to tell their fortune, and on this particular day, wants a love fortune. Sorrel, seeing an opportunity, tells Vivi that today you will find love by seeking out flowers. Vivi excitedly takes off towards the family gardens and finds Olivia doing some early morning training. Olivia has a flower tucked behind her ear, saying that the blooms in the garden were pretty and she thought it would look nice, and Vivi gets super excited, picks several flowers and puts them in her hair, then scampers back to Sorrel and says, "Oh my gosh, you were so right, I love flowers." And Sorrel just looks at her and sighs, thinking, "My lady, I adore you, but you are so stupid." But you know, like affectionately. Overall, I adore this trio. I think of all the character groups I've made for these videos, this one is hands down my favorite so far, and actually writing a little story about them could potentially be really fun. I have a lot of ideas and details I didn't have time to include in this video, but if you have any ideas for shenanigans they could get up to, leave them down in the comments. I'd love to hear what folks come up with. Before we wrap up, it's time for Star's Webcomic Corner, the part of the video where I promote my favorite webcomics, boost my fellow creators, and give you guys something new and fun to read. So, let's get into it. 20 years have passed since humanity pushed back an alien invasion. With only stragglers of the alien army remaining on Earth, humanity now studies the strange magic they left behind, attempting to harness its power for themselves. Leading the charge is WYCHWOOD, a research organization dedicated to the study of this magic both during and after the war, performing experiments and seeking out magical anomalies. One such anomaly is Tiara, a bull-headed delinquent with fire magic of dubious origins. When exploration of wartime ruins goes wrong, she and her friend Julian are cornered and recruited into WYCHWOOD, though not exactly of their own free will. While the shelter, research, and training the organization provides is valuable, a gilded cage is still a cage, and the two are clawing at the walls for their freedom. However, as they search for a way out, it becomes clear that there's more going on under the surface, and a sudden second alien invasion may well throw their entire world and WYCHWOOD itself into chaos. WYCHWOOD is a comic that's been running for a few years, and while I'm not usually a sci-fi girly, you throw some weird magic in there and you will have my dang attention. This comic got everything. Tantalizing world building, a fascinating science-based magic system, and a wide array of lovable characters who all bring something different and interesting to the table. Watching all these characters with their different lives, motivations, and values bounce off each other is a delight, and seeing them adapt to the circumstances the story throws them into will definitely keep you on the edge of your seat. Also, there's cool bug people. Did I mention cool bug people? If you'd like to check out the comic for yourself, you can read the entire thing for free at WYCHWOODcomic.com. I'll leave a link in the description, so go check it out. And that's gonna do it for this one. Hope y'all enjoyed it. I have a lot of fun making this type of video, so my goal is to try and make them more often going forward, and maybe branch out and try different methods of generating characters, maybe using other game systems as a base or experimenting with different attributes. If y'all have any suggestions, let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much as always to my lovely Patreon supporters. If you'd like to get early access to videos, comics, and sketchbook pages, my Patreon streams where I drew the art for this video, and more, please consider joining at patreon.com/castoff. A special thank you to my video shout out to your patrons: Holly, Mr. Don Matsu, Leaf, Alyssa Herzog, Neon Valkyrie, and Sammy Katz. Lastly, reminder that Frankie's Makeshift plushie is coming soon, so mark your calendars for that. And the Mermaid Costume Design Contest is still running until the end of March, so make sure to get your entries in. All those lovely links will be down in the description, but that'll be it for this one. Fare thee well, friends, and I will see y'all next time. Bye!